We were so totally numbed by ever-increasing anti-Semitic action of the German government that we had finally come to the point, contrary to the early feeling that we would believe that eventually Hitler would be booted out by the Germans, finally had we come to a point of view of total hopelessness.
At that point, my mom was driving to leave Germany, and my dad still didn't want to go. And she finally said to him, "Fritz, if you are not leaving Germany, then I will have to go alone with the children. I will not see my children killed in Germany. And I can't make you go, but you can't make me stay." And this is how my dad finally gave in. And then they tried to get out, but nobody, all the borders were closed. Our visa, our quota number, quote unquote, was too high. It would take a year or two. We had no time to wait for that. And so my parents heard about Shanghai.
And this just came up just like that. It was a sudden decision. My parents were the kind of people who were practically minded, and they said, "We'll grab this chance and we'll go to Shanghai, no matter what." And then there was this huge Italian liner called the Conte Rosso, there were three ships there, the Conte Rosso, and there was the Conte Verdi and the Conte Biancomano. We took the Conte Rosso, which was the middle of the three ships. Conte Verdi was the smallest. The ship headed for, first it headed for Suez Canal, through the Suez Canal, it traveled through there. Port Said, I remember that name. Port Said, actually, Egypt. And then from there we went to India, first Calcutta and then Bombay. And I remember standing on a ship, and the Indian Jews came out there and they brought us some food and they handed it out to us. They came up to the ship. Very nice. That's something which is a very pleasant memory of that time.
We got to Shanghai, and my father was on the pier, and Paula's father was on the pier, and we embarked, and there was my father with a rickshaw. Waiting for us, and we all climbed into the rickshaw. We never saw a human being pulling somebody else. And my mother was very anxious, and she said, "You have an apartment, you have a room to stay?" He said, "I have everything." So we got into Hongqiu, which was a place where later on the Ghetto was established. And we went into a camp. When my mother saw what's going on there, she almost died. My father talked by that time, and he said that's all the refugees goes in there, and they have rooms there, and they get food there. Well, we were put into a large room with 3-decker beds. There were 100 people in one room.
When my father saw that, he says, "My last penny will go to an apartment. I will definitely not live in those camps that were dormitories with 200 people in them, just sheets dividing the bunk beds between families." So we had our own apartment, one room, without any plumbing. We had potties we had to go on Later on, plumbing was installed in our building, and this was like luxury for us. We stayed in one room for 10 years.
In Shanghai, the refugee organizations helped to support us. They had large kitchens in which they made very simple, unpleasant, ill-tasting meals. Like twice a day, we all would go to these refugee kitchens to pick up the food, and many of us would get sick from that. And those who had a few dollars would supplement it, and those who didn't had to go to work. And it wasn't easy to find a job over there. And my mother befriended a family that opened up a sausage factory, and she went to sell sausages, and thus she could supplement our income.
There was no money to buy anything. The refugees just struggled with whatever they could do, whatever business they could have. They would just stand on the street with things to sell, or they were very inventive. Some women would bake and the men would sell them on the street on little stands. And that's, you know, we made do with whatever was available. There was a lot of cultural life among the refugees who tried to continue as good as they could to lead a life like we had in Europe. There was music among the population. It was music and theater, and we had our own newspaper or two. And they tried to make it as similar to home as it, you know, as they could. Of course, when the war broke out, after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. The Japanese were allies of the Germans. They put us into a ghetto.
The area of Shanghai where we lived, called Hongqiu, was occupied by the Japanese military, which started at the same night that Pearl Harbor was bombed. I got a little ahead of me there, and the Japanese Navy sunk all the Allied ships in the harbor in Shanghai, and then they took over the entire district where we lived, and they were rude and insulting, and some people were killed. It was not a very pleasant situation.
There was a proclamation put everywhere. I mean, everywhere you could read that. Any person who came to Shanghai, any immigrant, refugee, whatever, after a certain day in 1937, has to live in a certain area, and it was like a maybe 4 or 5 block circumference area, and was not allowed to leave it without permission.
In order to get this, you had to go through the police commissioner, who was a man by the name of Goya, who was not very nice to some of the people who gave out whom he issued these passes.
And he was in that part of in that police, Japanese police, and he was a very vicious man, a very, very mean man to certain people only, not to all people. He put a lot of people into jail, and that was sure death, because you get cholera, typhus, or somebody always died.
The situation became worse and worse because we had no money and we had no food. We started getting food from the committee.
We had a neighbor who he worked for one of the coffee shops which were owned by one of the Sephardic Jews who had a pastry shop there, among other things. And he brought home the coffee grounds from the first brew. And since my mother was the best friend and neighbor of his parents, my mother got the third brew. His parents got the second brew, my mother got the third brew, and they went down the row. All the houses got, until you didn't know if it was water or coffee left. And then they threw it out. That's how how it went. That's how scarce things were.
Sir Horace Kaduri, it was a very philanthropic family, and they helped the refugees a great deal. There was also a Sassoon family that was helping financially and with donations and clothing.
We were still very happy in general. I mean, if I want to sum up Shanghai at this point, we were still very happy that we were in Shanghai, my parents and I, that we did not have to go through what the others went through in the Holocaust. But in 1945, on the 17th of July, the Americans flew overhead, and they were going to bomb a Japanese radio station which was located in Hongqiu. But they missed. And when the bombs came, the shrapnels caught some of the refugees by surprise on the streets, and there were about 15 to 20 refugees who died at that time. It was a very tragic day for the refugees. The only time that Shanghai proper, where the refugees lived, was ever bombed.
Then one day, there was a rumor that the war was over. And of course, there was curfew always. And you couldn't go out after the, sundown. And we heard that rumor, and we kids kind of, came together and were in the doorways. And the Japanese patrol went by, and they didn't chase us, and there was jubilation, We knew then that it probably was true.
When we heard that the war was over, it was one big celebration. I remember my parents waking me up at midnight. That's when the news came through that the war was over. And everybody running onto the streets and dancing and yelling and shouting, and it was just non-stop partying.
Okay, now when the war ended, as I said, I used to like to go to the pier all the time. So when the war ended, the quota started. Now, whoever had a German quota had it made. They were able to leave for the United States as soon as they could. They got an affidavit and they were out. So the ships started coming out. The Americans brought transport ships in, like the General Meigs and the General Gordon, the President Wilson and the President Cleveland. These were all ships of the American President line in San Francisco. And these were converted troop ships into passenger ships. They were sent to Shanghai to bring the people to the United States.
But people who were born in Poland had a very low quota and couldn't go out. So what happened to people like my parents, they had to stay in Shanghai, and we really didn't know what's going to happen to them.
I had my affidavit, and I could have gotten a visa, but now we needed an affidavit for my husband and for his mother. And so my parents started trying to get and send affidavits. Meanwhile, you had to apply for a visa, and that took a certain time. I mean, none of this went fast.
My father and I, we had the visa to come to the United States. I remember swearing to the flag, President Truman's picture on the wall, and we had our visa. But my mother couldn't.
The yeshivas left first. The Mira Yeshiva and Lublina Lubavitch Yeshiva, they were held by the yeshivas in the United States, and they were brought here. Lublina ended up in Detroit, Lubavitch and Mira ended up in New York. Then came the other people who weren't able to go anywhere because they had very bad quota. Polish quota was rotten, so was the Romanian quota, Austrian quota. You couldn't get any worse than that. These people had to have affidavits from relatives in the United States. Then they had what is called preference quota. So if they had a uncle or a sister or a brother or niece or nephew or whatever there, and they sent them these affidavits, they were able to get out even though their own quota was bad. I used to come to the ship all the time, to the pier, and I used to see these people leave all the time. We used to just sit there and I remember I said, why, when am I going to leave from here? When we are going to leave, my parents and I.
And I want to, at this time, inject something here right now. I never tried to give the impression that we had the same dramatic, murderous experiences as our brothers and sisters in Europe who were in these murderous destruction camps such as Auschwitz. We, at the time, which we didn't know, of course, but I would never try to compare. While we suffered, we never came close to suffering what they did.
I always look back to Shanghai favorably. We lived there, I got educated there, we grew up really fast in Shanghai. I only lived there from 6 to 15, from the year 6 to the year 15. But those 9 years we grew up very fast, much faster than if it would have remained in Vienna, and there wouldn't have been any kind of Nazi terror there, or if it would have come to the United States. You grow up in conditions like this much faster and you mature much faster.
It was a time not real. It just wasn't real, the whole thing.